Hello and welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. This time we'll be looking at a weird little in-between era running from late 95 through to mid 96, starting with the band's second John Peel session on the 29th of September 1995. Never Wants to Stand Still, Brian and Garry returned to Radio 1 only 3 months after their previous broadcast, their Essential Mix show, with a completely new bunch of tracks for their second Peel session. It's remarkable to think that these early Dead Cities demos were not only broadcast a matter of weeks after the general release of ISDN, but then it's not so different to elements of Tales of Ephedrina and Lifeforms appearing on the Kiss FM mixes around the time Metropolis was released. Still, on 12th of September 95 they hauled their gear over to the Maida Vale 4 studio at the invite of John Peel, snuff guitarist Simon Wells in tow, to lay down some tracks for his show. Being the hugely popular show that it was, it's unsurprising that a cassette bootleg exists. What is odd is that the running order from the tape is at odds with the tracklist offered on the BBC John Peel archive and Peel Wiki, both of which suggest that Spatial Freakout was the first track. For simplicity's sake, I'll approach this from the bootleg's perspective. As one of only 2 radio broadcasts in this between era, the 95 Peel session is a fascinating document of the development of Dead Cities. The best example is a very early My Kingdom, probably very recently written. Garry's explained how it was first demoed by him at home, and this version matches his description of that, having a breakbeat that slows down at the end of each loop, giving the track a very strange stop-start feel. The extended opening is largely based around the Osric Tentacle samples, lacking the synths and percussion samples found on the final version. The Morricone flute and orchestra are also present, although the second unidentified flute line isn't. The Vangelis Hopkins vocal is also missing from the track, making it a strangely stripped down and raw affair. The twinkling synths add interest throughout, and a second funkier drum loop comes in for the second half, but overall it's clear the track still needed a lot of work at this point. There isn't enough to justify its long 9-minute runtime. Nevertheless, it's very rare we hear what is effectively a demo version of an FSOL track, and the journey from this version to the album mix and finally the extended part 1 on the single is a lot of fun to follow. Second up is Yage, also in a very early incarnation. A proper Earthbeat version of this arrangement would of course later be released as Hallucination. It's clear that at this point the Maida Vale team were far more used to electronic acts, and the band themselves are more confident in their own demands, as the session sounds smooth, lacking the rough around the edges feel of the 1992 session. Some of the effects are different, notably the reverb, but otherwise this version sounds faithful to the Earthbeat take. The track heralds the arrival of Simon Wells on guitar. Not an obvious choice for collaboration, Wells was a member of punk band Snuff. In Garry's words,
he's always been popping in. I mean, at first it started off, he was a bit of a blagger, and he used to pop in and just hang around and, make tea and stuff. And then one day he dropped off a flyer and said, "I'm playing tonight, come and check me out." And we went down to the Kilburn National, and there was like 3,000 mad pogoing idiots, jumping around while he booted footballs and played trumpets, doing cover versions of the Match of the Day themes.
Eventually they became good enough friends to work together, and his guitar playing appears in this track, chords slashing through in the second half. The guitars and heavy breakbeats make the track feel like a natural successor to ISDN. Spatial Freakout is the name for an early version of Quagmire. By far the closest of the 3 tracks to its album counterpart, the arrangement for the first section differs slightly on close inspection, and a spoken sample is added, but once the track slows down at the halfway point, things change dramatically. Most of the track elements are stripped out, a different, funkier bass line comes in, combined with the brass samples, taking the track into the same jazzy hip-hop territory as ISDN tracks like Snake Hips and The Far Out Son of Lung. Further jazz samples not featured on the album version come in, and even the jungle beat returns again. It's a fantastic version of the track, and if a deluxe edition of Dead Cities ever does come out, I'd absolutely love this mix to be on it. The spoken sample reappears after the track is faded out, leading to an amusing moment of banter between Peel and the track itself.
Are they going to suddenly leap back at me? I think not. Future Sat... Yes, they are.
But he can't have a handcuff. Suppose you think the girl is lying that thing.
I should have known, really.
These 3 tracks give an idea of what a 1995 Dead Cities might have sounded like, and it's something a lot closer to the sound of ISDN than the final album. All 3 tracks here are based around breakbeats and samples of live instruments, and they all focus on the slightly funkier side of the group's sound. Just over a fortnight after the recording, on the 29th of September, the session was played over the course of Peel's show. The tracks were later repeated on Peel's show of the 12th of January 96. The credits given to the BBC are both interesting and amusing. Brian's roles are listed as tapes, loops and sampling, suggesting that some of the material here may have been running directly from multitracks. Garry is listed as providing sampling and guitar. Wells is credited as Simon Snuff, providing guitar, and vocals are by Johnny Cock. I did a double take when I first read that. It turns out that Johnny Cock is an alias of Garry, although finding any vocals on the session, other than the brief spoken word sample on Spatial Freakout, which is definitely not Garry, would be a fool's errand. The session appears in full on YouTube. ISDN Art Futura Festival, October 1995. Now this is an interesting one, the band's only ISDN performance of 95, the essential mix of course being a DJ mix rather than a show of original material. It, alongside the 95 Peel session, documents the early development of the Dead Cities sessions. Art Futura is a festival of digital culture started in 1990, centred around Barcelona in Spain. The theme of the 1995 event was virtual communities, and FSOL's ISDN performances clearly fit the theme perfectly. Thus a 35-minute show was broadcast to the Centro Cultural de la Villa in Barcelona at some point during the 4-day festival, 18th to the 22nd of October. It's believed it was on the final day, but there appears to be no exact confirmation online. Before the main show, the band also broadcast a 25-minute pre-show build-up, essentially an abstract soundscape played while listeners came into the room where the main transmission would be heard. It's effectively an ultra-extended environment, lots of glassy-sounding drones, spoken word recordings, including what is probably recordings of the ISDN lines being tested, as there are plenty of phrases like "Garry, you're breaking up," "Garry, can you hear me?" and amusingly, "Hey Garry, do you want to do a television interview right now?" and snippets of tracks. A fractured version of Mains Interrupt appears near the start, and the digital drones and elements of Papua New Guinea just before 13 minutes would be later used on Environments Part 1. Although more abstract than their usual fare, it is effectively an entirely new 25 minutes of unique material, almost entirely unreleased elsewhere. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the main show shares a fair amount of material with the Peel session of the previous month. The opening environment is little more than some digital static, followed by some incomprehensible words, then Quagmire begins. The track has subtly developed from the Peel Session Spatial Freakout version, including the full extended intro environment that's included in the Outer of Glass on Dead Cities, and still having a slightly different structure and tempo to both the Peel and album versions. The intro's use of static and electrical buzzing feels like the first hint of the overall mood of Dead Cities. The outro is more atmospheric than the Peel version, lacking some of the funkier elements, and sadly a lot shorter. It's still a long way from the album mix, however. This is followed by My Kingdom, which has developed considerably in the intervening weeks. A longer intro environment starts the track, eventually introducing the breathy sample that acts kind of like a synth pad and percussion of the final track. When the beat kicks in, it's largely the same one from the Peel version, albeit slightly more restrained and less tinny sounding. 4 minutes in, the Mary Hopkin vocal arrives as the biggest development in the track. From this point, it deviates structurally from both the Peel and album mixes. My Kingdom is the only track we're lucky enough to have been given access to the development of in such detail. Seemingly plenty more work was needed before the final track was completed. The introduction of the pads and vocals, however, immediately give the piece a more haunting feel, again moving away from the raw of funkier Peel version. A brief environment follows as the track disappears into a bed of reverb, sounds from the end of the album version of Yage leading into the hallucination version of the track. This is the first studio version of the track heard, and it remains pretty much unchanged through to its appearance on From the Archives Volume 1. Their mix is clearer and subtler than the Peel version. The guitar outro is cut for an environment that would later appear on the 1996 tour, and a digitally stretched voice talking about drifting into a dreamlike state. It's pretty creepy. At 23 minutes, Brian and Garry throw in the first unheard material of the transmission, Fit Drowning. One of the darker tracks on Dead Cities, it does share little of the paranoid feel of ISDN, but on the whole the acid squelches, synth sequences and pads sound much more overtly electronic than anything on that album, and it definitely looks towards the band's future. An early version of Futura follows, another synth-heavy track. This version includes samples of voices saying the title, suggesting it may have been a short track put together specifically for the festival itself. The mix released on From the Archives Volume 2 lacks the vocals. It closes with the environment eventually used at the end of Her Face Forms in Summertime, which plays alongside the final new piece 100 Baby Spiders. This feels much more like an ISDN era piece with live drums and wild electric guitar improvisation. One wonders whether it was a track left over from that era or actually a new recording in the style. Intriguingly, this live version includes a brief snippet of the Omnipresence opening environment in the middle. Sound of machines shutting down gives the transmission an oddly abrupt ending. The Art Futura show is an important stepping stone in the development of Dead Cities. The material performed for the Peel session feels almost like an extension of the ISDN approach, but the changes made in these few weeks find the band embracing more synthetic sounds again, and the environments and new material all feel slightly more open and familiar in atmosphere after the surreal landscapes of the previous album. It also has a touch of the more melancholic and haunting sound of Dead Cities. It would also be the last appearance of the band in public for 9 months, and their last live transmission for an entire year, the longest break in new material in the group's history to this point. The band made a video for the quagmire element in this transmission, including largely reused footage, along with new 3D imagery that may have been transmitted to Art Futura at the time of broadcast and was named Spatial Freakout. The show was released as part of a Podroom update on the 7th of March 2010, incorrectly labelled as a 96 performance, the usual cover given a green and grey colour gradient. Aircut, Visual Attack. The worst part about doing this series is coming to a release like this. Licensed by Beat Farm to Phoenix Uprising, a hard house, hard trance label, Visual Attack gets a totally unnecessary upgrade in those styles, plus a vague variation on the original. Unapproved by the band, who saw no money from this release, it's a borderline unofficial release really. Brian's surname is misspelt Dougans. Move on, nothing to see here. Visual Attack, John the Dentist remix. John the Dentist, owner of Phoenix Uprising, who released this monstrosity for 12-inch, takes a string breakdown of Visual Attack and uses it as the basis for a shit hard trance track. Visual Attack, Humanoid mix. Never let it be said that Beat Farm didn't get their money's worth out of the original version of Visual Attack, presenting it in 3 subtle variations under 4 names. This is the original with the synth pad breakdown section also added to the start. Visual Attack, Billabong mix. Yippee! John the Dentist returns with a remix under a different alias, or indeed 2, Billabong and also Nigma according to the credits. After a hard trance remix under his main alias, here he provides something edging slightly closer to hard house. British dance music was going through an awkward phase at this point, the musical equivalent of the terrible fashion choices teenagers make. We've all moved on from this now, and hopefully not too many FSOL fans were conned into buying this piece of shit. Semtex, We Have Explosive. Release date 15th of September 96? Probably. Late summer 96. FSOL haven't released any new music in over a year, their last appearance on the radio was the previous September. Some new demos were broadcast to a digital media festival in Spain a few weeks after that, but otherwise silence. It's the longest silence in the group's history at this point, both the longest gap between releases and between radio transmissions. And suddenly they return with the loudest track they've ever made. Much like in late 94, the first thing they put out to mark a new era was issued under a new alias. This time, however, it was very much promoted as FSOL. It probably would have worked far better as an anonymous track than Far Out Son of Lung, as it really sounds nothing like previous FSOL. Okay, the B-side opens with the brief gurgling environment that's quite telling, but the big beat sound, the spoken voices, the harsh buzzing synth, the lack of weird alien samples scattered over the whole thing, it's absolutely 96 and owes nothing to the 1994 incarnation of the band. The A-side includes 2 of the main variations on the theme, both entitled, bizarrely, Semtex. This is especially bizarre as one of them would go on to be the album version of We Have Explosive. The other is the full-length version of Heard Killing. Both of these tracks would be released a few weeks later on the Wipeout 2097 soundtrack, the latter titled We Have Explosive, Heard Killing. 2 years before the Good Friday Agreement, the IRA was still very much a presence in everyday life in the UK, and earlier in 96 a bus was bombed at Aldwych in London. Naming a track We Have Explosive and releasing it under the name Semtex was seen as slightly unsympathetic, with accusations of the band condoning terrorism. For us, it's a painful element of living in London. Rather than avoiding it, we've covered it, Garry said at the time. The controversy didn't run for long, and the album version of the track would go on to become the group's second best known track, released as a full commercial single the following spring. A note on the track listing. With no title listed anywhere on the sleeve, fans have generally referred to the 12-inch containing We Have Explosive Heard Killing, and some variation on We Have Explosive Semtex version. The image on screen now, however, is of the master DAT, and it shows that at the time the A-side was intended to contain 2 tracks called Semtex, with the exclusive mix being called We Have Explosive. This then shows that a track list is present. The A-side has Semtex on the label, the B-side has We Have Explosive. This isn't an artist and title of the release. Well, it is, but it's a track list. Probably. They never make things simple, do they? However you name it, however, it's a hell of a comeback. Semtex Part 1. This is the full-length version of We Have Explosive, under the name Semtex Part 1, running to 6 minutes 19. Almost identical to the album version of We Have Explosive, except for 2 briefly extended sections that add almost a minute to the runtime. I'll cover the track properly when I get to Dead Cities. We Have Explosive, Heard Killing, also known as Semtex Part 2. The full-length version of Heard Killing has gone under a couple of names, neither of them Heard Killing. The first 2 minutes are similar to the album version before elements of We Have Explosive come in, most notably the guitar riff and buzzing synth line. It was probably wise to keep this off the album version, as the track here much more closely resembles a remix of Explosive rather than simply a connected track. This version will go on to form the basis of the live version, under the name Heard Killing, and also We Have Explosive Part 4, what's in a name anyway. Interestingly, on the Wipeout 2097 soundtrack, both We Have Explosive and Heard Killing credit Run DMC as composers, unlike on Dead Cities itself. Semtex, We Have Explosive. The 12-inch exclusive version of We Have Explosive is pretty different to the main mix, Brian and Garry somehow managing to mellow it out, add a lot more atmosphere, and still keep it as a loud big beat track. For a start, there's a ton more reverb here, opens on a weird gurgling environment that's the only obvious link to the band's earlier music. Most of the rhythmic work is unique to this mix, with touches of dub and hip-hop in the beats, especially in the weirdly phased kick loop that runs through most of the track. The synth buzz, guitar stabs and We Have Explosive vocal are kept largely to a minimum, letting the drums carry the piece. The ascending horn outro sound is used within the track itself. Nearly 12 minutes, it's by far the longest thing the band released while recording for Virgin, and it feels much more like a studio jam than an intricately structured track. Some elements run for a while without much change, effects are laid on thickly rather than subtly. It's easy to imagine the pair in Earthbeat improvising around the track's elements and coming up with this loose extended version. In that sense, it feels maybe closer to other dance acts of the time due to its heavy use of repetition. Think of the Chemical Brothers' electronic battle weapon tracks or one of Underworld's self-remixed B-sides. Alongside the 2 versions of We Have Explosive that the band provided to the Wipeout 2097 game, or Wipeout XL as it was also known, there was a 3rd track called Landmass, the only one not to appear on a standard FSOL release, and also only appearing on the game disc itself rather than on the accompanying soundtrack album. It's an atypical track for 1996, being the first conventional dance track the band had released since about 93. 303 squelches, a straight 4-to-the-floor kick, and a conventional snare clap loop aren't really things anyone would expect from a Dead Cities era track, and fans generally considered it to be an older track taken from the archives due to its video game sound. Then the most important moments in a life came along, with its Dead Cities planner page and accompanying postcard featuring Landmass on a near-complete Dead Cities tracklist. It turns out it is indeed a much older track which was unearthed and selected by the band's A&R man Rob Manley as being perfectly suited to the game. The title was no doubt ported over from whatever scrap Dead Cities track originally bore it. This was the only compilation appearance of 96 and indeed the last one for over 10 years. And that's it for today. It's just a short video covering a brief interlude period. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the development of Dead Cities, on We Have Explosive, on the music I've covered today. Do drop me a comment down below. There are also like, subscribe, share buttons there that you might like to press. All interaction really helps my channel. And I'll be back very soon with the next video, which will be a bit longer as it's about My Kingdom and the teachings from the Electronic Brain film. Join me then.